Welcome to our week 1 lectures for Intro to Genetics at SWIC. We will be using a book called Genetics, Genes, Genomes, and Evolution. Within the week or so, you should have this purchased from the bookstore. It's got a zebra on the cover, and we will be using that textbook as our basis for this class. I would like you reading the textbook along with our chapters and, of course, watching our lecture videos. There are study guides available online on Blackboard, and there will be quizzes that are set up within the book's online framework, which is actually a separate website. But we will be using that as well. For the most part, we are going to skip the prologue and chapter 1. We'll touch on a little bit of the prologue in our first lab, and most of chapter 1 we're just going to skip right over. It is a really fascinating example of how evolution and genetics are, or specific genes, are directly linked. But I find that it's a little bit cumbersome for students to recall a bunch of things that we're only going to talk about for a minute and jump right into some pretty serious molecular biology. So it's absolutely worth your time to skim over chapter 1, read it if you find it interesting, as it sets the stage for the rest of our book with a very tight link between evolution and genetics. And we might come back to that a little bit later, not sure yet, but we are going to basically dive right into chapter 2. Before we get to chapter 2, I am going to do just a little bit of background to set us up and put us in position to start talking about genetics. So the first thing we need to do is explain what genetics is, why we're here, why we are talking about genetics. So genetics is the study of inherited variation. This means that we are looking at some sort of molecule that is going to be passed on from one generation to the next. And sometimes it's an identical molecule, sometimes it's a little bit different, and we'll talk about how that happens. When we look at genetics and we talk about genes and our genetic information, we're going to talk about where that information comes from, how it's stored within the cell, how it's maintained, how it's passed on to the next generation of cells or the next generation of organisms, and then how it is expressed within the organism. That is to say, how it goes from information that's contained essentially in a code to the visible or chemical characteristics that a particular organism has. And then no two individuals are exactly the same, no two sets of genetic information are exactly the same, and so there's variation within that code. Genetics is very tightly linked to heredity, which is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. So you're familiar with this when you say, oh, my brother has my grandfather's large nose, or I have my mother's curly hair, things like that. These are traits that are passed down that you can see in family lines. Now, heredity does not just talk about physical characteristics. When you look at someone, you can see some physical aspect of them. This is also talking about things like genetic diseases and changes in pathways. So say lactose intolerance, maybe that runs in a family. That's something you can't see by looking at someone, but certainly a trait that is passed down among individuals within a particular family. So we're going to focus on all of these things at some point in our study of genetics. Before we get too far, I'd like to define a few things for you. And we're going to come back to all of these topics later, but they're words that I'm going to start using right off the bat. And so I want to make sure that you are familiar with what they are, even if you don't understand the full complete definition yet. Some of these we're going to talk about many times throughout the semester. We're going to start out today in talking about the molecule of DNA which is where all of our genetic information comes from. It's the location of the genetic information in our cell. And within that DNA, we have a plan that explains the structure and function of an organism. So not only do we get the physical characteristics that we see encoded in our DNA, but we also get all of the information for how to build and grow and reproduce an organism. So DNA, DNA is a molecule that encodes genetic information. So we're going to start off today talking about the structure of DNA. So you're going to learn way more than you ever cared about that DNA. DNA is also what is passed on to the next generation when we produce offspring. Our genome is the entire set of genetic information. So all of our DNA within an organism. And we'll talk about genomes in chapter 3, but an example of this would be the human genome. So all of the type of information is the same between you and me and the person sitting next to you and your grandmother and your brother or sister. They might vary slightly between the same species, but all of the same type of information is going to be there. All of the information that tells a human cell how to be a human cell and how to interact with other cells. A gene, and we'll define this a little bit more specifically later today as well, is a segment of DNA or of the genome that codes for a specific characteristic. And in most cases, this is going to be a protein, more specifically an enzyme, or a protein that helps a chemical process occur. A genotype is the genetic makeup. Now that sounds a little bit weird. This is comparable to a characteristic or a trait. So this would be something like eye color or lactose intolerance, something like that. And there's going to be a specific genetic code associated with that genotype. Phenotype is going to be the physical characteristic that you see, or the outward expression of that genotype. So I remember this by physical characteristic or phenotype. Phenotype is what you actually see in the individual, whereas genotype is basically the genetic code that produces your particular phenotype. So as I said, we're mostly going to skip over the prologue and chapter 1. The prologue is a great review of some overall ideas in biology as they relate to genetics. So that is definitely worth a skim, especially if you haven't taken intro biology in a while, or if you're coming back after a long break. I would definitely suggest reading the prologue just to jog your memory a little bit. If you're interested in chapter 1, by all means, take a glance at that. It is quite interesting, and it's a fantastic example of relating two different areas of study in biology. One of the things that they talk about in the prologue that is quite important, though, and I don't want to skip over, is the fact that there are two different types of cells. So we have two types of cells. The first type is prokaryotic cells. So a prokaryotic cell is, a single cell or a single-celled organism with no organelles. So organelles are like little compartments within the cell that separate the compartments from the rest of the cell. Now, prokaryotes do not have those compartments. They're going to be our simpler form of cells, but they still perform all of the functions that are considered required for life. So within prokaryotes, we have DNA, because all cells need to have DNA, and that DNA is concentrated in a region called the nucleoid. So that is represented here by this purple blob. Those are our chromosomes, or our DNA, so they're found within the cell. All cells are going to have a membrane, sometimes a wall also on the outside to separate them from their environment. And then they're all going to contain a few other things. They're going to contain something called cytoplasm, which is sort of the liquid or the jelly within the cell. And then it's also going to contain ribosomes. These guys are important in taking the genetic information and turning it into proteins. The other type of cell is the eukaryotic cell. So eukaryotic cells are generally multicellular or part of multicellular organisms. And this can mean an organism has just a few, or it can mean it has millions of cells. Now, in a multicellular organism, all those eukaryotic cells are working together. They're communicating, they're performing specific functions within the organism. One of the main differences between prokaryote and eukaryotes or prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells are that eukaryotic cells are much bigger than prokaryotic cells. And part of this is because the eukaryotic cells contain organelles. So organelles are enclosed by membranes that separate them from the rest of the cell. And they're important because they provide local environments. This allows the organelles to perform different functions within the cell in isolation. And so it allows them to perform a bit more complex functions. We have two cells here. We have animal cell and plant cell. For the most part, they're the same. There are some organelles that are specific to one or not the other. And we're not going to talk about all of those at the moment, but I do want to direct your attention to a couple important things. One, they have membranes, just like outer membranes, just like prokaryotic cells. Plants also have cell walls. They have walls and membranes. So that's one of the major differences. Other than some minor differences in types of organelles, they are essentially the same and work very similarly. They both have a nucleus. Because we're in genetics, we're going to talk about this quite a bit. The nucleus is where we house our DNA. So that's where our DNA, our genetic information, is stored. That genetic information is going to be expressed, and we'll talk about the process of expression a little bit later. We still have ribosomes, and those are a little bit harder to see. Ribosomes are represented by little dots here, but remember, those ribosomes are what is going to express our information. So we're going to take information from DNA, send it to the ribosomes, and the ribosomes are going to produce proteins for us. Some of these other components we'll talk about a little bit later. Mitochondria and chloroplasts contain their own DNA. Your own DNA in the mitochondria and the chloroplast, and we'll talk about those a little bit later as well. That genetic information is separate from the information found within the nucleus. So let's talk about where we are in the history of genetics. So genetics as its own field is quite young, actually. It's only been sort of defined as a field since the 1950s. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Before the 1950s, there was not a lot of well-defined genetics. That's not to say there was none. There's some very important things that happened before the 1950s. Starting with, in the mid-1830s, something called the cell theory. So two scientists, Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann, came up with something called the cell theory. So the cell theory states that a cell is the smallest unit of life. Now that means that organisms can exist as single cells. It also means that if you are missing any component of the cell, you're not going to have a living organism. So cells are the smallest unit that is considered living. Sort of the flip side of that is that all organisms are made of one or more cells. So all organisms have to be made of at least one cell, which makes sense if a cell is the smallest unit of life. And the other important feature of this is that the cell theory states that all cells must come from pre-existing cells. So this means that cells don't pop out of nowhere. The other thing that comes from this is that now we need some sort of molecule of inheritance. And that is where we will eventually get to in the molecule of DNA. A little bit later, Charles Darwin started studying natural populations, and we'll talk about him in just actually, we won't talk about him because we're not doing chapter 1. So Charles Darwin was a naturalist. He sailed around the world looking at natural populations, mostly in South America and the islands around South America. And based on all of his travels, he developed the idea of evolution via natural selection. So this theory says that a population can change over time in response to specific pressures within the environment. And those individuals that have traits that allow them to survive and pass on heritable information are going to pass on those advantageous traits to their offspring, and therefore that trait is going to increase in the population. So this explains changes in the population. I apologize, I seem to have a bit of a technical problem going on here. Anyway, sorry about that. So following, or pretty much about the same time as Charles Darwin, a man named Gregor Mendel was working on looking at the heredity in pea plants. So Gregor Mendel was sort of dubbed the grandfather of genetics because he was the first person to really record some patterns of inheritance. Now, he found several things. He found that traits would be represented in offspring, same as in their parents. And he also found, though, that sometimes traits were covered up. And so his work was really important in establishing patterns in how traits are passed on to the next generation. Continuing on into the late 1800s, microscopy gets better, and we start to see evidence of cell division. And so taking all of these things together, a couple of scientists named Sutton and Bovary put together something called the chromosomal theory of inheritance. And at this point, we start to link all of this information that has been swirling around, patterns of inheritance and cell division, microscopy, things like that. And the chromosomal theory of inheritance says that the units of inheritance, those things, quote unquote, that are being passed on to from parents to the next generation, actually reside in specific locations on chromosomes, and those chromosomes are passed on during cell division. So let's move ahead about 50 years, and we're going to skip some important things, but we'll come back to most of it. And there we get to the discovery of the structure of DNA. So there was all of this microscopy happening. People were looking at what was being passed on from one generation to the next, and a bunch of chemists and physicists were working on, and biologists were working on the structure of DNA, trying to figure out what it was and what it does. And in 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick very famously announced that they had discovered the secret of life. They had uncovered the chemical structure of DNA. And so that is where we are going to start in our genetics class, at the structure of DNA and how it came about.